Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. No. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy.
I'm Jay Carson, your host, sitting in for Mike Baranowski this week, and I'm joined by my colleague, Justin Holmes, a professor of political science at Northern Iowa University. Good morning, Justin.
Good morning, Jay. How you doing?
I'm heading into the weekend with all the confidence of Arnold Palmer heading to the clubhouse.
Gracious.
But so this will be a good show. Our topics this morning, first one is basically election palooza, right? We're sort of going to just talk through where we stand more or less a week or so out. And I will turn to Justin largely because of his expertise in like the actual numbers of these things. As you know, I tend to shoot from the hip and work by instinct, where Justin is an actual academic who actually knows stuff. Before we get started, I do want to mention something, Justin. This is kind of point of personal privilege.
Of course.
And I don't know how many Ohio listeners we have. I think probably a fair number because we're mostly Ohio-centric. But the passing of former House Speaker Joanne Davidson, she passed away yesterday at the age of 97. And she was a giant. I think she stood probably about 5'3", but she was a giant in Ohio politics. And someone who I got my start working with, working for, sometimes working against. But she was a classy lady, and it's one of those things where there's a tendency to look and say, "Wow, those were the giants of those days, and where are they now?" And I don't know whether that's something of a matter of because I met her in my youth, right? That you ascribe sort of more greatness, more serious, more grown-upness to those people than maybe you do currently, politicians who are of your own cohort. But she was Ohio's first woman speaker. She brought in essentially Ohio's Republican Revolution in 1994, ending 40 years of Democratic House control. No, I'm sorry, not 40 years. It was probably more like, well, it was a good 30-something.
Felt like 40
years of Democratic control. And she influenced the lives of so many people, and she'll be missed. So I just wanted to put that out there, that Joanne Davidson was a hell of a lady. So with that, Justin, why don't we turn to you, and let's talk about the state of the race right now, the presidential race, well, mostly.
Thank you for that tribute. First of all, that was excellent. Sorry for your loss.
Oh, it's
Yeah. So, boy, with election predictions, I feel like you're overselling me a little bit, which flattery will get you everywhere. But honestly, when the race is this tight, I can talk some technical stuff. But boy, you fall down to vibes at that point.
Why don't I lead off then? Because I do have some observations.
You have some observations. I have some discussion of polling stuff, but I also have some observations.
I have observations. I have observations. You have actual facts.
Yeah, go for it.
But so generally, I mean, as most reported, everyone says race is too close to call. All polls within margins of error, but the trend line seems to be favoring Trump, particularly in some swing states. He seems to have improved performance, or Kamala Harris has what's the word I'm looking for? Not improved, sort of topped out and possibly losing ground among independent or undecided voters, of which there are vanishingly few every day. Well, my couple observations, Justin, are this. One, the numbers that I think that are weird and different that I think favor Trump is that there has been a significant uptick in Republican voter registration. Almost always Democrats have the registration advantage over Republicans. And they still do in many places. But in a lot of swing states, Republicans have narrowed that gap and in some cases exceeded that gap. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean those people will vote or that they'll vote for Trump, but it's something different that you don't typically see. The other piece related to that is Republican early voting, which Republicans have typically not engaged early voting. I think that there's something to sort of the conservative demeanor that looks on it, much like I do, that you ought to vote on a Tuesday morning on election day like God and James Madison intended you. But there has been a big push by the national RNC to embrace early voting, and it seems to be have been working. Now, again, we don't know who those voters are voting for, but I think that there's a pretty good chance that being that Trump's the Republican nominee,
stands to reason.
Yeah, he's picking up the good deal of those, and I think those are two, I think, tailwinds that favor Donald Trump as we go into this kind of razor thin where it could be, game of inches type thing. So, but those are my two observations. I guess I have third observation is that the Harris media appearances have been uninspiring, I think, to Democrats and unconvincing to some swing voters. Even the CNN panel after her Anderson Cooper town hall seemed to be indicating that they didn't believe she closed the deal, in one commentator's words. But again, those are my observations, not actual facts. So for the actual facts, I will hand it over to you, Justin, to get your thoughts.
Get my thoughts. I think two of those were very nicely done in a technical sense, and the third one is as vibes go, a completely legitimate sort of thing. So don't sell yourself short on that. So I guess I'm going to actually make a prediction. I'm going to make a couple predictions and talk a little bit about why I think I'm right, and then talk about why I think I'm probably wrong as well. So, again, with the margin of errors being what they are and the tightness of the race, I don't have much confidence in any of these predictions. Most I would wager is probably one of those $5 McDonald's meals, if you want to take that bet. And since I like you, I would upsize the drink, if you win. But basically, I'm a little more bullish on Harris, but not by much. So I'm going to call the popular vote 50.7 to 49.3 as numbers that are totally made up.
Oh, I was going to say, wow, you really thought of that.
Had to pick something, And,
I'm nowhere near that kind of granularity, but
oh yeah, no, we're going granularity here, and we'll give myself.
That's why people call you professor, and they call me, hey you. But
hey you, yeah, I'm hey you a lot of the time too. But I'll put a 3-point margin of error on both of those to hedge my bets. So I'm arguing for a narrow electoral college victory of 276 to 262. So basically, kind of as I was putting together my map, that would be Harris takes the three contentious states of the last two elections, the Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, also takes Nevada and gets that one Lincoln, Nebraska vote. Trump takes Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, and the one Maine one. Going to go out on a limb here with betting absolutely nothing that in a total freak of nature that makes heads explode, Harris somehow takes Texas and wins the whole thing 316 to 222. Democrats have been
no. That is heads exploding territory.
That is heads exploding. Yeah, Democrats have been arguing they're competitive in Texas for like the last three cycles, so we'll throw that out there and I'll eat.
Can I just interject something on Texas really quick?
Yeah, of course.
That in the Democratic Texas pipe dream, what would be a better metaphor for I don't know, but
I feel like your gut on that is pretty good as a pipe dream.
well, the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee has injected some money into the Beto O'Rourke race. Last week, they pumped an additional $60,000 into the O'Rourke. Or no, I'm sorry. I'm thinking. See, I'm back into the
That's
last
like
time
6 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. It's deja vu all over again.
Yeah, the Colin Allred race.
Yes. My apologies.
He was
still
on
early in the morning. It's been one of those. Anyway,
yeah, he was asking me for $3 the other day too. So yeah,
but I'm saying that. So, roughly the cost of one, mid class luxury automobile compared to the amount that the Democratic Senatorial Committee has been dropping into Ohio, which is something in the neighborhood of the tens of millions,
right,
to support Sherrod Brown. So what I'm saying is, and this is one of my mantras, is don't look at what politicians say, look at what they do. The fact that they are assigning that little to Texas tells me that their internals say that it's not winnable and their resources are better spent elsewhere. Or if you want to take the really optimistic view, it's so in the bag that they're
so far ahead. Yeah.
But I don't think that's the case.
There was like one poll that showed it tied, and everything else has Cruz up by 4 or 5. Which would be...
Although taking this into account, I will when Mike's not here, I do tend to just kind of goof off more. I received a text message last night at 7:57 p.m. that says, "This is Ted Cruz. Can I count on you to contribute $5 before the weekend begins?" I get hit up by homeless people for more than that, Justin. I mean, so
well,
I don't know what that says about the Cruz campaign, unless he's trying to offset that 60 grand that Schumer pumped in.
I feel like Colin Allred's kind of trying to. He hit me up for 5 the other day, and then it was 3 the last time. So
okay. Well, you and I are both on the high roller list.
The high roller list. I feel like we're negotiating. Certainly not a used car at that point. I don't know what you can negotiate over $5 at this point.
Look, can you give me $3 at least?
50 cents
and get a cup of coffee before I go out to this event.
50 cents and a smile. Yeah. So I think that's probably right. And I think the Democratic Texas thing has been a pipe dream, for a while. I feel like they took the emerging Democratic majority book from 20 years ago to heart a little bit too much on that one. And, at least in terms of people's expectations. But so I wanted to talk maybe a little here because we have referenced polling a few times. And I wanted to kind of talk about a couple polling methodology points and kind of one version of this that might favor Harris and a second version that might favor Trump, essentially with the background that I have in political psychology, freely acknowledging that much of this might be motivated reasoning, on my part. But kind of some things here, we're all kind of familiar with the idea, probably most of the listeners, of margin of error, which is just sort of a measure of squishiness, if you will, and kind of estimates. Because, when you do a poll, you're sampling about 1,000 people, and obviously that's not everybody, and there's lots of reasons that we can't talk to everybody before an election. So we have to be sort of cautious there. There's a whole lot of math that underlies it. But basically, a typical national poll has a margin of error of plus or minus 3, which means, both numbers could be 3 points bigger, 3 points littler. And so, anything that's a point or 2 points spread, we can't say with any certainty that person's winning or losing. The problem, or the thing that I think, there's been a pretty good discussion of this post kind of 2016, is that's just the random component. So, if everything goes right, then we know that then we still can't be any more confident than the margin of error. The problem becomes, and we've seen some of this in arguably the last 3 rounds of elections, 3 out of the last 4, 16, 20, 22, that there could be something systematic going on. And by that, I don't mean anything intentional. I don't use the word bias specifically because that conveys something else. But if there's something else going on, and that's entirely possible, that, you could be off by more or off more specifically. And there's no way to know that, unfortunately, until after the fact. Post hoc, we can try to figure out what's going on. Beforehand, we can't. So the problem that we see is that polling response have just fallen off a cliff. And so, back in the golden days of phone surveys, you'd get about a 65% completion rate. Basically, if you called 1,000 houses, 650 would talk to you and fill out complete the survey. So you'd call, 1,500, give or take, to get 1,000. Completion rates for surveys these days are in the 3% range. So, yeah, it's bad. It's shocking that they've done as well as they have, to be honest. But, there's concerns and a whole literature out there on biases, even back in, there I go using that word I said I wasn't going to use, errors, even when the numbers were good.
Right. When you mean bias, you mean it's sort of built, it's not an intentional bias by
absolutely.
The pollster.
There's nothing
it's just
intentional
a
about
function of reality, right?
Function of reality, absolutely. So thank you for throwing me a rope there, because it's early and the caffeine is not totally soaked in. So, yeah, basically you can randomly call people, but not everybody's going to complete the thing. And what we tended to find was, old people in particular, because they answer phone calls, would answer these. And so we've done all kinds of things to you could do stuff after the fact to kind of weight the sample, which everybody does, because you're not random.
But the weighting is still a little bit guesswork.
The demographic
or more an art than a science. Is that a better way to put it?
For the demographic part, no. The likely voter part, yes. So, basically you should know the demographics roughly. And so, you can adjust things for age, gender, income, state, et cetera. I mean, you can apply kind of a mathematical correction there that should fix that. But all of that's assuming that the people that are in there are typical of their type.
Right.
Right. And so, the concern that I have at this point is that even with the weighting that you get, some groups in particular, they may be atypical, if you will, the people that are responding. So I'm kind of basing all of this on difficulties, in my estimation, this time around of estimating young people in particular. I think the young people that answer surveys are maybe more atypical than others. They tend to lean a little bit more Democratic. So that's, I think, a little bit where I'm going with this. Second thing here is that, in terms of discrepancies, I've actually stuck up for kind of the quality of polling both in 16 and 20. And I was quoted in a newspaper story, and then the Facebook posts were brutal. I should never read the comment section, but because I said, the national polls actually in 16 weren't all that bad. It said a narrow Clinton victory within the margin of error, and the national number was within the margin of error, Clinton victory. Of course, it's the wrong winner, and so people get angry about that. But I mean, polls did what they could do there. But 1620, there was a definite Trump underestimate. Not by as much, I think, as some people think. But the sense that I've gotten, and this is where I wish pollsters were a little more transparent, but is that they are doing some corrective things about that to kind of try to balance off, some of those polling errors there. But 22 Democrats actually outperformed. There's nothing kind of inherent in this that one party or the other is sort of favored. You tweak the assumptions, you tweak this is the art part of it, and you're spot on with that. But ultimately, those tweaks, you don't know if they're any good until after the fact. And so my kind of hedging on this is that, it looks more like 22 than it looks like 16 or 20. And in particular, the art of this is in kind of the predicting likely voters, which is just good luck with that. Mm-hmm. You can't just ask people if they're going to vote, because this is actually one of the number one survey questions that people lie about.
Yeah.
There was a great study about 20 years ago where they actually validated that, because it's a matter of public record if you voted. And so they just asked people and they looked them up. and about 10% of people after the fact.
That's a little
lying.
sinister, isn't it?
But I mean,
No, but go ahead.
you ask it. Yeah, I mean, you ask with consent.
They called him back and said, "Why the hell didn't you vote?"
Oh, the number of things in political behavior that get a little cynical, and Ted Cruz actually picked up some of that stuff, but that's another story from one of my colleagues, actually uncredited, of course, but another story for another day. So everybody's got their own special sauce on this in terms of predicting likely voters, and nobody shares is the problem. So, like Ann Selzer, who runs the Iowa poll, is arguably the best election pollster in the country, who unfortunately only does Iowa. One of my colleagues called her up and she basically said, yeah, there's no way in hell I'm going to tell you what I'm doing. That's kind of my brand. Best guess, and what we see from kind of some of the academic stuff and whatnot, and Pew and some of the people that are transparent about this, you use a battery of questions, not just are you going to vote, that figures into it, but how many of the past elections have you voted in? How interested are you in the election? My personal favorite, do you know where your polling place is? They don't actually check that, and that's kind of what most people seem to be using something of. But there was this great piece is in the opinion section of the New York Times in I think it was 16. They had 4 pollsters and they gave them the raw data and said, apply your likely voter formula to it. And they got 4 radically different results, from the same underlying data. But where this goes wrong, and this actually speaks to something that you had said a second ago, and this is a point of divergence and from us a little bit, where these tend to go wrong is that they have a history bias to them a little bit. Again, bias not purposeful, but they tend to play up people that are consistent participators. And so one thing that you actually see in 2008, 2016, is that if you have a candidate that's moving some new people into the electorate, they tend to overperform because those new voters don't pass the
haven't been taken into account in the yes.
Correct. So they get thrown on the discard pile, essentially. And so kind of Obama does that, in 16, and there's some fairly good evidence for that. In 20, the flip side, 16, I think Trump does that to a degree too. I feel like that's a less talked about part of polling mistakes there. So, I positing here that maybe Harris is turning people out, that's kind of there. One other sort of positive trend, if you look at kind of the favorability, Harris is at least tied at favorable and not favorable, whereas Trump is still underwater. She's been growing on that, in recent surveys. So, from the polling standpoint, I would argue there is at least a case to be made for a slight Harris win, not for my Texas win. And if that happens, I got to figure out something humiliating to do for having even broached that. A couple campaign factors. One thing that's been sort of interesting, there have been a number of Republicans that have come out in opposition to Trump in recent weeks.
Yeah.
Kind of a long survey in Wisconsin.
I don't think that moves the needle substantially.
Well, that's in a second. I have a why I'm wrong list. So yes.
Oh, okay.
That's exactly on there as well. Okay. So I'm going to make my case, and then I'm going to undercut my own case. So I don't think it moves Republicans. I think it might move independents, of which there are precious few. But that has some potential. Kind of the other thing here, to the extent that Harris has been uninspiring on the campaign trail, and I think that's a fair assessment, Trump has done some really weird stuff in the last couple weeks. The rally dance party and things like that, and just even slightly more unhinged rhetoric than normal. So all of that pushes me maybe in that direction. Where I could be wrong, there's not clear evidence that Harris really is pulling in new voters, and I think kind of your registration stuff speaks to that. In particular, to actually reinforce your point a little bit, in general, Democrats have a lower yield from the registered voters because the same sort of demographic things that predict being a Democrat also predict not voting.
You left me the hanging curveball there to say, because most of them are dead or non-existent or something like that. But we'll go with with your version.
Most of them are dead. Yeah, well, it all comes down to canvassing the graveyard at this point. So, no, but, young people who vote at much lower rates, poorer people who vote at lower rates, et cetera. So, what we've seen historically is that Democrats have always enjoyed sort of a party identification and even registration advantage, but they get a lower,
typically tremendous advantage.
tremendously. So, I think, where I would sort of concede your point or think you have a good point is that, if Republicans don't have to even win on registration to potentially win, because the yield is better. So that's their. I'm not sure that she's pulling in much. There's also some evidence, and this is kind of a finer point in polling methodology stuff, that basically it is harder to get people to answer surveys if their candidate is running a campaign that they're concerned about. So there's this really interesting kind of a panel study back, if you remember that first Obama debate in 2012, where he just absolutely tanked for reasons that nobody's ever explained. And so they had a known list of people who had agreed to be in this survey. And they found that they had a substantially harder time the day after that event to get Democrats to answer the polls, like a noticeable drop off on response rates. So a few other studies have sort of demonstrated something similar, that some of these changes that you see in response to campaign stuff is just that people don't feel good about it and don't want to talk about it, but they're not changing their votes or anything. So, it could be that some of this Trump stuff, people are kind of like, oh God, I just don't want to talk to anybody about this, but I'm going to go, grudgingly vote for him. So,
well, I would say, so I didn't want to jump on. Did you have a couple other things?
Only that my last bullet point in my notes was that I'm not sure how much pull any of these anti-Trump Republicans have, and then I'm going to turn it over to you because I've been yapping. But
yes, and I agree with that absolutely. So my take on this, and again, this is more just a feel experience. Republicans, I think, tend to underpoll almost always. You can point to some exceptions, but I think they do, and I think part of it is there is sort of a conservative mindset sentiment that one keeps these things to oneself. They're not anxious to talk about. And this is where I weigh in with what Mike calls anecdotal. But
can I give you a second version of that would also potentially reinforce what you're saying, actually?
Sure.
So the other potential issue there is that from a theory standpoint, at least driving it, the polls also come from institutions that conservatives don't trust.
Yes. So I think that's exactly, yeah.
So it's not just a generally I don't want to talk politics with people because holy cow, do I see red hats?
None of your damn business.
The Hy-Vee.
Yeah.
But it's more, they're happy to talk with it to some people, but if you identify yourself, the two big polling sources tend to be media and academia.
Yeah.
And so if you're being forthright in identifying who you are. So, yeah, I agree with you on that. I do think there are some exceptions, though, and it's not, again, there's so many sources of, this is one of those things, there's so many things going on in any one poll that can push one direction or the other that it's basically impossible to disentangle all of them. Yeah, so.
Right.
Anyhow.
And I would say to my second point of that, I think Trump even more so, right, just because of the nature of Trump. And there is a sense of, maybe it's different from the I don't feel like my team's doing well versus I'd just rather not share that, in many circles, voting for Donald Trump carries a fair amount of social opprobrium. And I think people just don't want to deal with that. I think you can probably, this sort of goes along with like the likely voter question is, I think there is a trend that is documented somewhere that you would know about, that people tend to sort of want to give pollsters the answers that they think they want to hear.
Your gut is really good on this.
Well, see, I've been doing this for a long time. Yeah.
So if I can give you a slight a terminology correction, social opprobrium, you got one of the words, social desirability is what we call that. And so
it's opprobrium where I live, but
opprobrium, desirability, tomato, tomato, blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, and there's a whole literature on this. There are all kinds of questions, that, people feel like there's a right answer, and there are a lot of techniques that have other trade-offs and problems that you might use to try to get at the people's true feelings. The classic one is questions about race. Anytime that something might make somebody look racist, like they always give the less racist answer. But election turnout, is one. And if you remember back to 2016, Kellyanne Conway actually floated this prior to the election. She didn't use the word social desirability, but this was the shy Trumper phenomenon, as they called it, that basically, people were, not willing to admit to anyone that they supported Trump, which on the one hand, I think is technically correct and part of the story. Not that it's a lot. I mean, obviously, if you've got a "Let's Go Brandon" sticker on your truck and a red hat, you're perfectly happy to share those things. But, when we have a race that's, the polls are within a half point, all this stuff starts to matter. It doesn't have to be everybody. It just, if it's a few people. On the other hand, when she said that publicly, I thought, boy, this is one of the damnedest campaign pitches that I've heard. We've got more support than you think because people are embarrassed to talk about our candidate. Is not it's a technically correct, but rhetorically not something I'd say out loud.
Well, I wouldn't say embarrassed, just perhaps choosing not to engage in what would be so my other gut piece on this, on polling and how I think it affects here is I do think, and maybe you've got some, again, actual facts on this, but in my experience, Democrats are much less reticent in general. This is just sort of the other side of the coin, to talk about their politics publicly. In fact, some of them you can't get them to stop. And I think that is more on the Democrat side. And again, this is just sort of a constitutional, not constitutional like our Constitution, but constitutional like that's just sort of in their makeup. That political things tend to be more important to Democrats than they do to Republicans and independents, for a whole variety of reasons we could do a whole other show on. But all that's to say is I think Trump's under polling, and I think that's going to be a factor. Yeah,
I'm not sure. I can't say I've seen anything on that last point, in terms of loquaciousness, if you will. But I think ultimately this is why I'm willing to wager nothing with more value than the $5 McDouble combo, over this. I think just within the polling, I mean, I think, you raise a number of good points, as well. I think it's ultimately, when next time we're on together in November, I'll have a great post hoc story about which one of us is right.
Yeah.
I think there are forces pushing in both directions potentially. So I think just given that we probably want to move on to another topic.
We do, yes.
Too long. Do you want to make any predictions for the House or Senate?
Prediction. I would say narrow Trump win. I think Trump wins in Wisconsin. I think he narrowly loses Michigan. I think Pennsylvania is going to be a train wreck. I do have deep concerns that this will come down to Pennsylvania and, disputed ballots and counting, and do we count them when they come in late and all that sort of thing. I think Trump loses Georgia narrowly. And so I think that's where I am, but I think that all adds up to a Trump victory. I think Republicans take back the Senate. I'd say 3 seats plus 3. House, I think Democrats narrowly keep control or retake. I'm sorry.
Boy, and I'm maybe a little more pessimistic on that, but we don't have it. I pessimistic from my standpoint anyway. I don't see a scenario where Democrats take the Senate back. Although, gosh, I almost feel like after this happens, I'm going to send Colin Allred at least $2 just to kind of secure that. I don't donate much, but there have been a few candidates where I donate again for $20 to whoever's running against them, and Ted Cruz feels like the kind of person that would do that for me in certain ways. But anyhow, I'm going to go with actually nothing changes in the House with the narrow Republican victory there. So I guess it's ultimately our question. I suppose our predictions here are, some version of divided government versus
yeah, I think so. Yeah,
unified.
So going on to mentioning things though that might make Republicans not want to vote for Trump, and I think to me, and again, I'm a weird outlier, but this issue does a lot more for me to move me to a non-Trump voting camp than anything that Liz Cheney might have to say, is the issue of tariffs. So I guess recently Trump, for example, his pitch in 2016 and 2020, and certainly more so now, is one that tends to be of protectionism. He recently said that tariff is the most beautiful word in the dictionary except faith or love. And so he's proposed universal baseline tariff of 10 or 20% on all imports to the U.S. plus 60% on China. The average tariff rate currently on all U.S. imports is about 2%. And, the Tax Foundation, which is not a Kamala Harris leaning think tank,
exactly.
Has noted that this would push tariffs to highs not seen since the anyone Smoot-Hawley tariff back in 1930. So, look, as someone who is of the more traditional Republican vein and free trade Adam Smith type guy, this gives me significant pause, concern for a Trump presidency. I think one of the X factors is, would he actually do it? Could he actually do it? But anyway, your thoughts on tariffs?
Yeah, boy, the first thought I had is, as somebody who's only been on this show for a little while, there are language questions that I have. So we'll just go with bat guano crazy, I suppose, is a family-friendly version. This tariff stuff is just wild to me. He actually kind of my motivation for thinking about this topic a little bit and then throwing that out there was he actually had a quote Thursday, I think, where he wants to repeal the income tax and replace it with tariffs, which, holy cow, which should be fair.
Which actually, that's how our country functioned for 150 years or so.
You beat me to it. Yeah. It's our history was originally, excise taxes and tariffs as a revenue source. For what it's worth, it's also, holy cow, like the economy was pretty unstable during a lot of that period. But I think, especially in a sort of modern interconnected world, this just strikes me as a nightmare, on multiple grounds, and I'm sure there's an economist somewhere that's on board with this idea, but boy, I haven't seen much, in terms of favorability from really anybody, on first, even just, raising tariffs in general, not by anybody, but, anybody that knows about these things. But holy cow, replacing the income tax with that is, that's
and to me this is one of those things that Trump says stuff, and I would say there is no chance in hell that it would ever actually happen.
Right. I think that the latter
to do something like that, that's not something you could do unilaterally. That would require Congress.
Any tariff stuff would require Congress, and so
the president does have some powers to impose, temporary that kind of stuff,
temporary things. Yeah,
but I agree. Like an across the board 10% tariff on everybody would certainly require congressional action.
Right,
and I don't see that happening. You would have so many players rushing in to put a kibosh on that.
Yeah, and I think to me, that. I think there's another, it doesn't necessarily have to be. I mean, I agree with you on the free trade Adam Smith thing, but to come at it from a somewhat more progressive position, there's also, this sort of thing shifts the tax burden, and I think hits lower income people, I think especially hard.
Oh, absolutely.
Given that so much of, I'm going to throw myself in there. So much of our income goes to consumer goods. That's, I think there's there are other questions of fairness in terms of where the tax burden goes.
Well, any sales type tax is going to hit lower income folks disproportionately.
Right. And so, I'm guessing we might disagree here, but I'm a big fan of progressive taxation, and these sorts of things are not.
Yeah,
So,
I don't love it, but
yeah, it's the third most beautiful word. Progressive. I don't know my previous two, but at any rate, so I don't like him on those grounds either. But I think some of this, I don't know how much of this going with Trump where he gets these ideas from. I mean, he gets stuff in his head and just runs with it. And I think some of it does come from, I mean, he is just really mad at China and whatnot. And I think some of this is just he really wants to go back to like this version of 50s America, with kind of billowing smokestacks and the Cuyahoga River on fire and things like that. Was the Cuyahoga that caught fire?
it did, yeah, multiple times.
Yeah.
Although it hasn't. So, fun fact, if I can interject, and I know we always run along, but
Flaming Rivers, I want to hear it.
The fire that caught the most attention in 1968 was actually a fairly small fire, but the fake news Time magazine ran a picture of an earlier fire from, I think, the 40s or so, that showed like these massive flames reaching up to engulf bridges and so forth. This is one of the things they, so many people say launched the environmental movement, was this fire, which again, back when it actually happened for Clevelanders, was like, river caught fire again. But
you can adapt to a lot of things.
Yeah. And so the other interesting reason of how that story and the picture and everything took hold is that week, did I say 69? It might have been 68. But the cover story had to do with Ted Kennedy and Chappaquiddick, which had just happened. So it was this is in the days when people bought news magazines to find out news and in-depth sort of stuff, right?
Yeah, boy, and it's two bodies of water in one episode.
So part of this, was the
too soon.
I think they were sort of brought in for the Chappaquiddick scandal and stay for the burning river. But that said, with all credit to the liberals and progressives and the cleanup efforts that have happened, the Cuyahoga River is now really a beautiful place, and we're restocking all kinds of fish that haven't been seen in the Great Lakes for years and all that.
I feel like we could have a consensus around I feel like we found.
I would say yes.
Over our time together, several issues. If we were going to wage a campaign, the two of us, starting with "Don't shoot dogs," as I recall.
Don't dump toxic waste into the river.
Don't set rivers on fire. I think is good. So I guess where I was going with that.
Industrialism, as it was in the 50s.
Yes. I don't get the sense that Trump understands much about the modern economy, to be blunt. He's got this view of, this is when men were men and smokestacks were smokestacks and whatnot. But, it's not just sort of if you throw a tariff on things, even stuff that is nominally made in America has, large quantities of foreign components in it. And so, actually one that's been in the news, a little bit over this, because they even kind of came out and said, well, that's not what happened, is John Deere, which is a good 2 miles from where I sit. They make the giant $500,000 tractors. But, a lot of components in those are foreign, which has been sort of a point of contention. But, they, even your,
there's a little bit of, as long as for Chinese, I think that would be a little bit of a point of contention.
It would be bigger, but a friend of mine actually used to work in kind of high level procurement there. And, he would have these stories. I mean, they'd go over to Europe to negotiate parts, purchases and things like that, and so that's going to be true of a lot of things, a lot of things that are nominally American. As I'm looking around my music room here, got a Fender guitar amp that's full of Czechoslovakian vacuum tubes and I'm sure Chinese transistors and things like that, so, I think he misses that as well. There's just not much. And, I'm all for more American manufacturing so long as it's not setting bodies of water on fire. But we are so far down that rabbit hole at this point that, I have no idea, even if you posed a giant tariff on things, in terms of turning that back into kind of American factories, that's decades or more. And frankly, even some of these, nitty gritty component things, I don't know that there's ever any reason to manufacture those here again. So.
Well, and so I'm going to go back to, listen, Adam Smith, right, who is widely regarded as sort of the founder of capitalism, free markets, all that.
And if I can interject, the kind of invisible hand line, as I recall, was specifically about international trade.
Exactly. Justin, you get me.
Did I steal your thunder?
You did. I was going to say the Wealth of Nations was most specifically about this sort of free trade. And it's the idea of, look, well, if the French can grow, or produce cheese more efficiently, cheaper than we can here in England, and we can grow wheat more efficiently and cheaper than they can in France, the better idea for everybody is to trade, right? You get better products at lower prices. So yeah, that's exactly, the rest of the free market stuff kind of came as an extrapolation from the free trade piece. So yeah, that's and I do think the Trump era he thinks of this 50s, 60s industrialism is sort of a mythical era, not mythical, it really happened. But the idea that you can go back is mythical. It was based on a number of unique things. For one, it's a small slice of time, right?
Right.
It was based on a number of unique things that were going on in the world at that time.
Like Europe being flattened.
The production in Europe and Asia.
We've taken out any competition from Europe and Japan.
Yeah. So yeah, so it's not something you can just bring back by tariffs. That said, I've always said there are reasons where for national security things we should do stuff to promote internal manufacturing, right? That I don't think we want to rely on foreign suppliers, particularly China, for important components or medicines or those types of things.
The brand new F-35 knockoff from AliExpress.
Yeah. So, but that's and I think also I would argue there's a place for tariffs in response to unfair trade, like intellectual property theft and so forth.
And dumping.
But the idea that of protectionist tariffs that you're just going to recreate industry, I think Adam Smith, delivered the verdict on that back in 1776. So
if I could put put this a slightly different direction with the politics, I would put a question to you.
Oh, I'm sorry, Justin. One more thing.
Oh yeah, and then I'll put a question.
I probably am going to screw up a question. The other piece that this overlooks is so much of what American manufacturers, in terms of goods, well, we need someone to sell them to. We're not going to buy them all here, so we need to be able to sell them abroad. And if you do this tariffs, what the experience has been in the modern times, and by modern I mean 1930s Smoot-Hawley type stuff. The response is reciprocal tariffs from these other countries. So.
Yeah, it's interesting actually to go back to the tractor example. I got tractors on the mind this morning, but John Deere actually builds their mid-size tractors in Europe because that's the market for them. So you can, if at least some of those models might actually be imported back, in this direction, even from American companies. So, anyhow, where I want to go with you a little bit, I get the sense on a lot of policy things, you might be a little bit of a Republican outlier, not everything, but, on at least some. Do you have a sense, clearly, I think with, this tariff thing has had a resonance with certain voters. I think some people certainly have gone down that rabbit hole. Do you have the sense, setting aside the income tax repeal, which I do think is kind of a non-starter, is there an appetite among sort of Republican electeds for more tariffs? Is this something that he could build any kind of coalition around, or is this sort of him being a total outlier.
I think this is to some extent Trump selling himself to this blue collar conservative demographic, which is ironically sort of the same sort of demographic I grew up in, right? And it's one of the reasons I became a Republican was because I sort of looked at this and said, my gosh, this is nonsense from an economic standpoint. So look, I think it's got some electoral appeal. Whether it actually works policy wise, because once you do try to implement these things, I think, and again, I can always be wrong, but what you'll see is it will be a diminishment of economic activity. It'll start with, listen, it's going to be inflationary because what will happen is companies will pass these costs on to consumers.
No, China's going to pay for this.
Well,
much like Mexico's going to pay for the wall. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think there's the inflationary problem, and then the secondary problem is look, when other countries stop buying our stuff, then we start laying off our workers, and factories start closing, and all that. So I think, from a policy standpoint, they're bad ideas, and this used to be sort of the standard Republican line. Now that said, there are a lot of people. Justin, I grew up in a place where congressmen had fundraisers where for $25 you could take a sledgehammer to a Toyota.
I remember seeing that. That was not my thing, but yeah.
But
the Toyota probably still ran another 200,000 miles after that.
Exactly. I grew up in a place where the BMV, right, where you went to take your driver's test, had signs outside saying foreign cars steal jobs. And if you took your driver's test in a foreign car, you failed. I mean, true story. I mean, this is not, so.
And it's a very different world. I mean, so,
yeah. But what I'm saying is there are still some out there, those voters.
I think there might be more of those voters, but if I can throw a personal anecdote in there, my dad ran for office in 1990 as a Republican and in a kind of rural-ish central Illinois, area, and kind of made a didn't say it out loud, but was very specific about driving an American car during that period, and oddly enough, started buying foreign cars after he lost. So, I see that appeal there.
Well, and I'll tell you that it's particularly pronounced in places like Western Pennsylvania.
Sure.
So that the appeal of that message of that foreign companies are stealing our jobs.
But I guess is that turning into electeds is kind of where I don't have as good of a finger on the pulse of the sort of Republican caucus as you
right.
do. I mean,
will that actually translate into policy stuff, or is it just a campaign pitch?
Right.
I think it's the latter.
This campaign pitch. Yeah. I mean, I would tend to agree but you're my insight into this world, so that's why I have to throw these things out there. Well, do we have any other tariff thoughts?
I don't, other than, like I said, I think we will see that this is, the lesson is always to take, Donald Trump seriously, but not literally. So I think there could be a sense of, we'll do stuff to help boost American industry. My sense is it's probably more in the world of subsidies, right? Rather than the tariffs, which, again, that doesn't do much more for my conservative soul. But I think you could get more lawmakers on board with that approach than that. And I think, as I said before, to the extent you're talking about targeted tariffs to deal with bad behavior or to preserve some sort of national security advantage, which even then, I think the better way to do the national security probably is with the subsidy rather than the tariff. But I mean, again, I could see some policymakers getting on board with that. But to the question we just answered, no, I don't see just the so many, the manufacturers of the country, the Chamber of Commerce, all of these economic folks would come in against it. I don't see it
A
happening.
lobbying bonanza, unlike the likes.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, it may be a lobbying bonanza of like, hey, instead of the tariffs, why don't you just give us some money? And that would be a good sell, I think, unfortunately for a lot of people. But so that's all I've got, Justin, as we wrap up, today's show. Unless you've got other predictions or tariff stuff to mention.
No, I think I'm good, and I am loath to make predictions at this point. So, yeah, I we'll be able to reconvene in a week or so, and have a sense of what happened. But
so with that, then I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. There's no tariff on becoming a member, and we're happy to accept your. Can we stop there and I can?
Yeah, absolutely.
Redo that.
So
I goofed up the opening. I'm looking for the little thing of who I have to thank.
So if we could be quiet for a second, because that helps Michael find the spot.
So we don't fund this show through tariffs. We do rely on your generosity, and we want to thank all of our supporters for getting us here, especially our executive producers. And I'm pausing because I still can't find the damn thing. Okay, I found it. So if you're not already a supporter of the Politics Guys, we hope that you will consider becoming one to help us keep the show going strong. As a supporter, you'll get ad-free versions of everything we release. The full-length midweek episode is coming up, which is going to be a freewheeling discussion of fascism and I think probably some other isms, right, Justin? And you get access to our Politics Guys Discord. We can interact with the hosts, and you'll even have the opportunity to listen in and comment as we record the show. You can support us on Patreon, where you can even sign up for a free trial. So there you go, no risk. If a monthly Patreon contribution is too much of a commitment, or if you've got issues with Patreon, or you're a current supporter and want to give us a little extra one-shot contribution, we have PayPal and Venmo support options too. You'll find links to all our support options at Politics Guys Support and in the show notes. If you'd like to get a full-length midweek episode, but you're not in a position financially to support the podcast right now, just email Mike at mike@politicsguys.com, and he'll be happy to set that up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, we'd appreciate it if you could subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, or just shout it out at on the corner, as well as share episodes on social media. And finally, a very special thanks to our executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode next week, and we hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,